Today I'm going to talk about dark heritage and specifically about humanizing dark heritage.
This is Design Sciences.
So, in a way, the first question is, what do we mean when we talk about dark heritage? We all think we understand what heritage means when we hear it. For some people, it's historic buildings. For other people, it's foodways and other intangible practices. It can be whole landscapes and whole places. And dark heritage is generally understood to be the types of heritage, especially places specifically, that are connected with difficult and traumatic past. So dark heritage is very closely associated also with dark tourism because bizarrely, for some reason, people really seem to enjoy going to places connected with difficult and painful pasts. Sometimes this is an act of curiosity, and there's a lot of research into the psychology of dark tourists, but it can also just be because places are very well known. So people visit for reasons that places are simply well known, or it might be out of curiosity. Another very important reason that people go to these types of places is connected with remembrance as well. Last October, with my bachelor's students actually doing a course called Dark Heritage, we visited Kazerne Dosan in the city of Mechelen. It's a place with three different purposes. There's a museum, a memorial, and also a research center looking at human rights in general. And it's a very important place in terms of really reflecting on the Holocaust in particular, but also other injustices over the years since then. So with the students, we looked at the ways in which the museum chooses to interpret and explain this history. One of the very interesting features that you can't miss if you do go to Kazerne Dosan is that along the wall spanning 4 floors of the building, you see 25,843 pictures. And these are pictures of the victims who were rounded up, taken from Mechelen to the concentration camps during the Second World War. Now, it was the Nazis who targeted the Jewish population, but little known to many is that the Belgian government at that time took the opportunity also to target Roma people. Now, the wall itself, it has 25,843 pictures. Some of them are actual photographs, some of them are just silhouettes in cases where they haven't been able to locate pictures of the individuals. And although they repeat this number many times throughout the museum, they never actually use the number on the wall. They don't number these people, and that's because they've been numbered before in the past, and this is not going to happen again. So more importantly, at Kazerne Dosan, in the interpretation, in the searchable database, and in the many stories that the active tour guides give, they name people, they rename them, and this is part of the humanizing process, that it's considered very important to make sure these people are not just numbers, that they're actual human beings. And that's a very important part of trying to deal with the former dehumanizing. Also last year, here in Antwerp, we were very lucky to have, for our Heritage Studies master's students, a guest lecture from Vern Harris, who is the senior archivist for the Nelson Mandela Archives in South Africa. And he spoke to us about his experiences of talking with survivors of the apartheid period. And he has some very interesting things to say about burden. When we're researching dark heritage, we also have to think about our responsibilities as researchers and the potential burden that we could place on individuals. And one of the observations that he told us was about how, in many cases, we want to have these memorials, we want to think about commemoration and have either converting the previous buildings into museums or other interpretation places, or simply building new monumental memorials. But Harris's point was that for many survivors, it's much more powerful and much more healing, in fact, to do smaller scale participatory projects, and actually sometimes preserving places connected with the past, and especially with difficult past, can be actually more problematic. They become places that are interesting for tourists. People want to visit from outside, But for the local people, for the people that were affected, they can be less helpful. In many cases, they would actually rather see these places torn down. They simply don't want to have to deal with these places again and to see them. And it makes a point, I think, that ways of healing are very individual, especially from recent traumatic pasts, and that there isn't necessarily one correct way of doing this. And often the ways that states decide to do this, through commemoration, through official musealization, if you like, isn't necessarily the most effective way. So talking of that, I wanted to mention another project that I've been involved with in the United States, where my brilliant colleagues at Michigan State University are busy making the Internment Archaeology Digital Archive. And this is a digitalization of 2 internment camps in sites called Kuski and Minidoka, both in Idaho. And these were 2 of many internment camps put up by the United States government after the bombardment of Pearl Harbor as a reactionary and racist response, where they rounded up Japanese, but also Japanese American citizens, and put them in these encampments. So digitizing the information, it includes giving 3D scans of artifacts that have been found, especially at the Kuski site, but it's also about making the actual archives from that period available. And not only have they worked with people like me, heritage specialists on their advisory board, but they've also talked with survivors and descendants of survivors. And this has been really important in order to deal with this still sensitive topic in as careful and mindful way as possible. One of the things that came out of this, especially talking with survivors, was that there's a particular word used in the archives at the time, and that word is alien. And the decision is that that will not be a searchable word on the database because it has the power to dehumanize all over again. And so we shouldn't just put all data available necessarily. We still have to be mindful of the effects that words can have. So my final reflections for this short interlude into dark heritage is that there are 5 main points that I would like to make. The first, of course, is rehumanization. Many people who've been victims of periods of difficult pasts have been deliberately dehumanized, either by pogroms or by imperial and colonialist policies. And so it's very important to rehumanize those people, whether it's making sure that their names are spoken again, or making sure that something isn't said about them if they want that privacy. We're not entitled to everything from the past. So another important concept to think about, I think, is the idea of burden. Many people become spokespeople for their communities and for the heritages that they're associated with. And this can be an unfair burden. You find people who've had to speak time and time again, whether it's to journalists, to anthropologists, to museum visitors, to tourists, about their experiences. And a point comes when this can be simply too much. We also know that there were certain communities, especially people who've been victims of colonial policy in the past, who frankly are sick and tired of being studied by academics. And so sometimes the burden is so great that we simply shouldn't do this research, even if we think it's interesting. Speaking of time, we talk about time as being a healer, and it has been shown many times that as you move further away from a difficult period, it does indeed become easier to talk about. And so sometimes we may have to wait until it's an appropriate time to address certain dark heritages. At the same time, new generations are coming through, and they may have their own feelings. They may resent this difficult past. They may feel they want to know more about it. They may want to forget it. And we have to remember that different people will have very, very different expectations and perspectives on this. And this brings on to the issue of responsibility. So as researchers, we carry a great responsibility when we do participatory research with people, especially in heritage, but even more so with so-called dark heritage. Often as researchers, we find that there's a great amount of expectation in what we do. People may have unrealistic expectations about what's possible. So finally, I think maybe the most important concept in dark heritage scholarship is actually the idea of forgetting. Not everybody wants to remember difficult past. Not everybody wants to confront it and deal with it. And that's perfectly fine.
Universiteit Antwerpen. Bepaal mee de toekomst.